Vic Mullen, grumpy old Scotsman. How are we all doing? So, the Labour con. like some of the people up on stage. Like, why are you up on stage? You don't make it. I'm not going to get into the conference itself. Needless to say, the Labour conference was part train wreck, part lies. Let's face it, we were all expecting it. But it begs the question, why is this Labour Party such a disaster? Now, to answer this, we've got to go back in history. We've got to go back in history a fair bit. A fair bit. Now, the current Labour Party is actually quite a young political party, because before the First World War, it was usually the Conservatives against the Liberal Party. Yeah, there was a big Liberal Party before the Labour Party. Labour didn't really find its footing until the interwar period. That was between the First World War and the Second World War. That's when the Liberal Party of the UK basically started to fall apart. Some of the more right-leaning Liberals were just completely detached from the more left-leaning Liberals. And it was the left-leaning Liberals in the old Liberal Party that essentially broke off and formed what would essentially be the current Labour Party. Now, there was a Labour Party from the very, very late 1800s going into the very early 1900s, but that version of the Labour Party is not the one that's in existence right now. So the Labour Party is actually quite a young party in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to the Conservative Party, that is one of, if not the oldest standing political party, definitely in Europe, possibly the world. That's how long the Conservatives have been around for. They've been around for a very long time. Very long time. But the UK political system, especially the first past the post system, follows a cycle. And this cycle started round about the early 1900s, roughly the 1900s. And what generally tended to happen is the Conservatives got in, lowered taxes, brought in a lot of investment, raised the baseline, may as well just call it the baseline, raised the baseline, like the overall amount of money coming into the government, raised the baseline of tax income, and then generally started infighting, which is what the Conservatives usually tend to do all the bloody time. If they're not fighting about Europe, which they are these days, they're fighting about the meaning of being a Conservative. If they're not fighting about the meaning of being a Conservative, they're fighting about, should we call ourselves the Conservative and Unionist Party, which is what they used to be called, or should we just be called the Conservative Party? Usually 2 terms. It usually takes the Conservatives 2 terms before they start fighting amongst themselves. They do it all the time, and that's what leads people to vote them out, because they're sick of the fighting, and they usually, before Labour, vote in the Liberals, or now they vote in Labour. But there's a cycle. And this cycle usually starts with the Conservatives. And what they generally tend to do, which stopped recently, more about that later on, but what they generally tend to do is bring in more money. It's essentially what the Conservatives do. They bring in more money either by lowering the top end of tax to entice more rich people back into the country, or lowering the top and middle areas of tax in order to make the middle class a little bit more wealthier, so the middle class go out and spend more or save more, therefore settling down the interest rates so the Conservative Party can start investing. The thing is, by the time the Conservative Party goes round to investing, they're usually fighting amongst each other, and then they get voted out, which means the Labour Party pop in. And what do the Labour Party see? They see a treasury chocked full of money and lots of income coming in from a baseline tax that's been raised up. So they spend. Take, for instance, the last major Labour government, not Tony Blair, the one before Blair, which was the Labour Party that basically ran in to the beginnings of the winter of discontent. Now go before that and you have the Labour government that ran for one term straight after World War II. Winston Churchill, who led the country and the coalition government all the way through World War II, was voted out in 1945-1946. The country wanted a change, and can you blame them? No, because they've just been through 5 years of war. Well, technically speaking, 6 years of war, the London Blitz, Coventry being bombed to rubble. They wanted a change. Labour were brought in. But here's the thing, under the coalition government, Winston Churchill signed a deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then when Roosevelt died and Harry S. Truman took over, Harry S. Truman upheld the deal. And the deal was a simple one. Britain borrowed cash. We were bankrupt. The Second World War bankrupted the UK. Completely bankrupted it. That's why rationing was still going on well into the middle of the 1950s. If your grandparents are still around, and they were around during World War II, ask them how long it took for the UK to come off rationing. There was some items, mainly fruits, that were still on ration cards as far in as 1958, 1959. That is almost a year. In fact, it's more than a year, coming to think of it. More than 10 years, sorry. Count, Vic, it would help. More than 10 years after the Second World War ended, Britain was bankrupt. And there was a massive bailout in the form of a massive monetary loan that was held over in the form of US dollars and US bonds from the US government to the United Kingdom. And we didn't pay off that until 2009. Bet you didn't know that. Yeah, 2009. That was a very long-term loan. But Churchill was voted out before he had a chance to spend it. Labour got in Aaron Bevan, the original staunch Labour folks, the staunch Labour folks. And back then, a lot of Welsh Labour Party members were actually in lead positions of the Labour Party. And Labour seen the billions of pounds, well, dollars actually, the billions of dollars sitting in the Bank of England. NHS. Healthcare reforms tied to the NHS, and the education system was reworked from the ground up. And that was all done in the space of essentially 5 years, because that Labour Party were really only in power for basically 5 years, because Churchill was voted back in. For his first full term, not in war. He was actually Prime Minister twice. So end of 1945, end of the Second World War, Churchill was voted out, Labour got in. Labour, although they'd done a relatively good job, weren't doing a good enough job at basically rebuilding the country. They were kicked out after 5 years. Churchill was voted back in again, around about 1949, 1950-ish, round about 50, 51, round about there. But by that point in time, Labour had already blown most of the money that was actually sidelined for setting up the health and welfare of the British nation. The trouble is, Labour overstepped a little bit more, because not only did Labour set up the National Health Service, which Churchill was already kind of planning to do, they also overspent on the education system, and more importantly, they overspent on a brand new welfare system that Churchill didn't want to come in. He just wanted a redo and an overhaul of the healthcare system to basically turn it into the National Health Service, and a slight redo of the education system. But once again, Labour overspent. They've got a nasty tendency of doing that. If Labour sees a pot of money, they overspend that pot of money by 2 times, and it's something they've always done. So Churchill was left to pick up the slack, and it was up to Churchill and members of that and members of the party that got in to basically nail down the NHS and set it up correctly, and then bring in the dentists and bring in the opticians. Try and figure out what the hell Labour were trying to do with the Welfare Reform Bill, as it was called in 1947, and try and find out what Labour were trying to do with the education system. By the time Winston stepped down as Prime Minister due to health because he wasn't in the best of health by that point in time. The NHS, the welfare system, and the welfare reform bills and packages were now in law, thanks to a lot of cash that Churchill managed to get from the United States. So fast forward a little bit more, just a little bit more. We're leading in to the end of the 1960s, going into the 1970s. The Conservative Party were on their knees because they had Ted Heath. Even though Ted Heath was a respected politician, he wasn't a well-liked politician. And he also happened to be the head of the Conservative Party in opposition. This is one of the reasons that led to the rise of Margaret Thatcher, because Ted Heath was a decent economist, but he was useless in front of the camera. Like, totally useless in front of the camera. So what Labour were doing was, once again, they were spending the pot of money that the previous Conservative government had basically tallied up. Strikes. Yeah, this is when strikes started to happen, and leading up to the winter of discontent in 1976, the National Union of Miners and a whole bunch of trade unions, including the early formed TUC, the Trade Union Congress, were essentially holding the Labour Party hostage. That's what they were doing on the run-up to Ted Heath becoming Prime Minister, on the lead-in to the winter of discontent, because the Labour Party were trying to battle an overspend that, again, the Labour Party always do, an overspend to do with, again, the NHS, which is a bottomless pit of money. You can throw as many suitcases of cash as you like at the NHS. It will just vanish and you'll get nothing in return, especially these days, because there's way too much management and way too much red tape wrapping up the NHS, so the doctors and the nurses just can't do their jobs. But that's because of the trust system that Tony Blair brought in. So Labour overspent, again, like they always do. But at the same time of overspending, the Labour Party were trying to pardon me, you get the hiccups all of a sudden. The Labour Party were trying to sneak in more and more bills and more laws that would essentially give the trade unions more power. And this is where the cycle starts to firmly embed itself into politics. Rise up. The Conservatives gain power, cash, throw a lot of money at the Treasury, start infighting, rise down. On the second downturn, you've got the Labour Party coming in, spending all the money in the Treasury, getting all the free shit, but then, as they're giving the populace money with one hand, they're taking something with the other. In the case of the run-up to the winter of discontent, what was basically starting to happen with the Labour Party is they were trying to give the major trade unions more power to direct the policy and politics of the UK. And this is kind of what led to their downfall, because these trade unions knew exactly what Labour were trying to do on the run-up to 1973, 74, 75 and the winter of discontent of 76. That's what caused the collapse of the Labour Party. They just couldn't hold on to power anymore. The trade unions basically held them hostage. There was nothing but strikes going on. They got kicked out, and Ted Heath's Conservative Party got voted in at the worst possible time that a Conservative Party could take power. Right in the middle of what was essentially the UK being held hostage by trade unions. And there's one thing that the Conservative Party hates. Well, there's actually two things, to be honest, that the Conservative Party hates: Europe and trade unions. Ted Heath was basically held a bag of excrement, the biggest bag of excrement ever held over in the history of British politics up until that point in time. And that's why it was Ted Heath that was basically forced to bring in the 3-day working week, power cuts, rolling power cuts across the country, because once again, the trade unions that were given too much power by the Labour Party while the Labour Party was waving around free cash to keep the population quiet had basically screwed the pooch. Which then leads us into Margaret Thatcher. What Thatcher did is what most Conservative parties do. If you look at Thatcher's first term in power, she done the exact same thing that most other Conservative parties have done in the past. The top tier of income tax for the top 5% and the middle tier for the the top tier of income tax for the top 5% and the middle 3 tiers, no in fact it was 2 tiers back then, the middle 2 tiers of income tax for the middle class, so basically the middle 35% was lowered. And what that essentially done was 2 things. The people that fled because of the 83% tax rate. Now I mentioned this in a previous video, but this is what Labour done on the run-up to the winter of discontent. They overtaxed the rich. And what do the rich do when they're overtaxed? They leave. And that 1/3 chunk of income tax, gone. So the middle classes and the working classes have to be taxed more to make up the shortfall of all the rich people leaving. And Margaret Thatcher knew this. So she dropped the top tier and the middle 2 tiers of income tax by a fairly big percentage. And what happens? All the rich people came back. That 1/3 chunk, it started getting paid again. Now I'll admit, the first term, the first 4-5 years of Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister was a rough one. But she was inheriting the after effects of the winter of discontent that ended in 1977. She came into power in 1979 when the Ted Heath government basically collapsed and then Labour got back in for a shortened term. But she was inheriting the after effects of the winter of discontent. She was inheriting a British steel industry that was bankrupt. It was bankrupt, and it had been bankrupt for the better part of a decade. She was inheriting a mining industry where 70% of the mines were operating at a loss, and out of those 70% of coal mines, half of them were bankrupt. But the reason this was never tackled before is one thing. The trade unions were too big and too powerful. It was because of Britain's failing industry, the steel industry, the coal mining industry, and the heavy goods industry, that Britain had basically become the poor man of Europe, which is what we basically are right now, to be honest. But it's the reason we've become the poor man of Europe. Britain's industries were not keeping up. They were not keeping up with Europe, and they certainly were not keeping up with the cheap imports that started to come in from China, especially in the mid-1980s. So what did Thatcher do? She either sold it off or shut it down. It was a very, very rough first 5 years of Thatcher being in power. But by the time Thatcher became Prime Minister for her second term, things were different. Things were different. A lot more small businesses were popping up. A lot more industry that was outside the traditional industries of the UK had started popping up. It was the beginning of London becoming the financial capital of basically the entirety of Europe. And this was all down to what Thatcher termed, or wasn't Thatcher, I think it was Kinnock actually that first coined the term. Yeah, I think it was Neil Kinnock, leader of the Labour Party back then, that first coined the term Thatcherite and Thatcherite economy. So I'm sure it was Neil Kinnock. Sure it was. All the way through the middle to the end of the 1980s, Britain was the richest country in Europe. It was simple as that. It was the richest country in Europe. And that was a massive turnaround, huge turnaround from what Britain was like just 5 years prior, 1979, 1980, when Margaret Thatcher first took office. What Thatcher had realised is Britain had to move on. It costed a lot for local communities, especially up here in Scotland, because what Thatcher essentially done is Thatcher gutted Scottish industry. Completely gutted it. There were millions left in unemployment, but while the unemployment rates were rising, those rich people especially the upper middle class and the top 5% of rich, they were all coming back. They were all coming back. So it meant that with that 1/3 ring of income tax now being filled in again, Britain could afford those, I think at the highest it was something like 2.3 million unemployed. See, I can't quite, because I was like 9 years old or something back then, but I think it was like 2.3 million unemployed at its highest rate. But because Thatcher had lowered the income tax bands, it meant that the rich people that had deserted the UK, along with a lot of the upper middle classes that buggered off to France and Spain, they decided to come back. That 1/3 ring of income tax was filled back up again. During Thatcher's second term, she ended up lowering the bottom bands of income tax to ease the pressure on the working class, essentially, while at the same time bumping the middle class income tax rate by 1 single percentage point, which would ease off the lack of income or the drop of income tax coming in from the working class. She basically played a balancing match. But because all the income tax was being filled in again, it meant that those 2.2 to 2.3 million unemployed could actually sign on, and the welfare budget wasn't going to bankrupt the country. And that's one of the major reasons that Thatcher was not in any great hurry to try and bring the unemployment figures down during her second term. So by the time she got into her third and final term, and she got booted out because, again, Conservative Party infighting, this time it was about Europe, and John Major came in. What basically happened under Major was also a Thatcherite. Even though the Treasury didn't have a lot of money left in the coffers because of overspending due to the poll tax and the overspending due to the poll tax implementation, what did happen when Blair came in 97 was Blair was inheriting the richest country in Europe. Sure, there wasn't much money left in the Treasury, but the income tax takings were phenomenally good. Germany, France and Italy, at that point in time, the 3 major countries on the European mainland, could only dream of having an income tax and tax income as good as the UK's. And again, this is where we see the cycle repeat, because Labour started spending. But at the same time, and this is leading up to now, and why this particular Labour government just can't get a grip on things, what Tony Blair did is Blair took the Labour Party from the left and shifted it to the centre of politics. Dead centre, in the middle of the Overton window. And while he did do the tax and spend thing, Tony Blair was shifting much more in line with what Thatcher did with Thatcher economics. If you look at what Blair did for the first 2 stints of him as Prime Minister, he was basically doing Thatcherite economics. He was lowering taxes for the middle and upper class, slightly lowering taxes for the working class, which would entice more businesses in, entice more millionaires in, to increase that 1/3 of the income tax ring, so it would then become half of the income tax ring. Did you know that during Tony Blair's second term, it got to the stage that so many millionaires and so many businesses were moving into the UK that 49% of the income tax that the UK was taking in was being taken from the top 5% of income earners. 49%. There's Thatcherite economics right there. Of course, the whole thing collapsed when Gordon Brown took over, but for Tony Blair's last 2 terms, he was playing Thatcher's game. Pulled the Labour Party into the middle of politics. But that had repercussions that is now affecting the current Labour Party. Because you see, by the time Gordon Brown was kicked out of number 10, because the Labour Party had become the Tory party, light blue essentially, they were doing tax and spend at a massive increased rate, especially during Tony Blair's last term as Prime Minister, after or during the Iraq War, leading in to Gordon Brown becoming Prime Minister as Tony Blair's replacement. Blair had overspent on the Iraq War. There's no getting around it. He overspent dramatically on the Iraq War, to such an extent that there wasn't enough money coming in from the Treasury to fund it. So what did Blair have to do? He had to borrow exorbitant amounts of money off the gilt bond market from the UK, to such an extent that by the time Tony Blair had left as Prime Minister, the UK was just under £800 billion in debt. Brown took over. Iraq War was over. Brown tried to right the ship, but no one was listening to Labour anymore. But the problem is when Cameron came in, the Conservative, the first Conservative Party, or the first Conservative Parliament to come in after Tony Blair, because Cameron had teamed up with Nick Clegg. And Nick Clegg had forced Cameron to pull the Conservative Party away from Thatcherite centre-right and pull them into the centre. So now you had Labour in the centre and the Tories in the centre. There was no difference. There was no difference at all. And what David Cameron realised is when Tony Blair had overspent so much money that there was no money left in the Treasury, and the tax income from income tax and from VAT and from national insurance was not enough to actually finance the debt, the cycle started. Each individual Prime Minister since David Cameron has had to consistently borrow money from the not the International Monetary Fund, well, that might be coming actually for a bailout, but they had to consistently borrow money from the Bank of England via the selling of bonds and gilts. And this is where the cycle gets broken, because you see, up until this point, the Conservative Party brought money in, saved it. They get kicked out. The Labour Party go in, see this big pile of cash in the Treasury. Their eyes go, free shit! And they start spending all the money the Conservatives have saved up. But at the same time as they're spending all the money, they're trying to do the bad shit that nobody likes in the background, which is exactly what Tony Blair did. You remember Tony Blair's first term, while he was throwing the cash around for new schools and new hospitals, the Supreme Court was set up that nobody wanted. He set up what would become almost the UK giving up the pound to take the euro. But again, while he was saying, well, I think it's a good idea for the UK pound to be ditched and we take over the euro that was being implemented, he was dangling cash in front of everyone for more new schools, more new hospitals, a redo of the rail network to bring it more in line with Europe. So it's dangle cash in one hand, take from the other. This is a trick Labour's always done. They've always did this. And now we get to Keir Starmer. Because with the complete mismanagement of the Treasury and monetary policy from the absolute shambles of the last 5 years of Tory rule, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves walked in to a bankrupted Treasury and over £1.5 trillion worth of debt from the bond market. They can no longer wave cash in front of everyone and take with the other. Now all you're seeing from the Labour Party is bad news after bad news after bad news after bad news, and they don't have any cash to throw at people to distract them. This Labour Party that we're seeing right now is very similar to the Labour Party under Tony Blair's first 2 terms in office. I mentioned digital ID in the last video. Tony Blair wanted digital ID in his first and second term. I'm going to be mentioning in the next video how Labour is going after disabled people to basically try and scrap vast sections of the disability welfare budget. Tony Blair tried to do that during his second term, and he almost succeeded actually. But the difference now is Labour's got no money. So they can't go, we're going to completely redo the disability benefit system. Oh, look, free cash. Look, we're going to build a new hospital over there. We're building a new school over there. Free cash. They can't do that. They can't do it because there's no money left. Bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news. Keir Starmer would have been a semi-decent, and I'm just saying semi-decent because he's bland and boring, but he would have been a semi-decent Labour Party leader and Prime Minister if he actually had money in the Treasury. But he doesn't. This is why any time you see Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in an interview, look at their eyes. Especially Rachel Reeves, look at their eyes. Because you see them smiling, but the smile doesn't reach their eyes. They're scared. They're terrified at what they have to do next. Because they know that they don't have any money left in the Treasury and no bonds and gilts to give out via the Bank of England, because the Bank of England can only give out so many more bonds and gilts until the international market goes, hey, hold on a minute, you already owe us X amount of money and you're not paying it back. We're not buying any more of your bonds. The Bank of England know it, Rachel Reeves knows it, Keir Starmer knows it, and there's nothing they can do about it. This is why this Labour Party seems so bad. It's because not only do they have an incompetent Prime Minister, they've got no money left in the Treasury, and right now the UK's £1.5 trillion in debt, and we've got the highest bond interest rate in the world. As I mentioned a couple of videos ago, last month the UK government had to borrow £20 billion just to keep the country ticking over. Did you know that 17 billion of that was spent just on the debt interest? £20 billion in, 17 billion back out immediately just to pay the interest on the debt. That's how bad the UK is right now. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves knows it. Look at their eyes. They're terrified. They are absolutely terrified. Yep. This is why this Labour Party seems drastically worse than any Labour Party that came before them, because they simply don't have the money to distract us with good news. All they're giving us right now is nothing but bad news after more bad news after more bad news. Where is it going to end? I honestly think Keir Starmer's not going to be Prime Minister by the end of this year. At the latest, end of January next year. And I honestly think that whoever the next Labour Prime Minister is going to be, they're going to call an early election for the end of 2026, beginning of 2027. I don't think they're going to last the full 4 years. I honestly don't. Anyway, have a good one, folks.